Hi, Higher Politics. Hope we are doing well and we are quite comfortable with conservatism now. So, we now move on to our second ideology, which is socialism. Now, socialism is a fairly new idea within ideologies when compared to conservatism. And the key word within socialism is, of course, social. And socialism is something that is often associated with the colour red, as you can see within the writing of the PowerPoint here, folks. But socialism is something that is very, very broad. That's something that I want you to remember, that socialism isn't just one clearly defined viewpoint, but it is defined by certain characteristics. Now, as you can see here, that it talks about bringing about some sort of equality within society. Now, that might seem like a really obvious thing to consider, but in actual fact, what does equality actually mean? Does it mean equality of outcome? Does that mean that basically everyone should earn the same wage, have the same living standards? Or is it about equality of opportunity? Does it mean that everyone should have the same starting point in life? Um, is it about equalising the playing field? Say, for example, someone has difficulties in certain areas of employment because of disability or race or gender. Should it be the state's role to kind of even that up? So that's also something to consider. People define themselves as socialists on various different scales, whether it be equality of outcome, equality of opportunity. That's something that is up to the individual, and we'll see the differentials in socialism as we go throughout this. Another one is cooperation. Believe it or not, folks, the co-op that you go and you spend your money in, the co-op emerged from the cooperative society, which was this idea of helping people at a local level and having a shared interest in things. And we'll talk about cooperation very shortly. And also the importance of government or state intervention. This idea that the government, uh, left alone, is a force for uh, regression, but in actual fact, that the state can be used for good to try and level the playing field, to try and make things fairer, and to help people make social and economic progress. So, it is a very broad idea, socialism, and let's have a look at it. So, as you can see here, folks, this man on the left of your screen is the godfather of socialism, and he would consider himself a communist. Very famously, he wrote a book with his friend Friedrich Engels called The Communist Manifesto. He also wrote a book called Das Kapital, which means capital, money. And he is someone who we would consider to be a revolutionary socialist. So he believes that the idea of capitalism, this idea of people making money and making profits, is at the expense of people being exploited at the bottom. And he believed that society had to be completely overturned in order to even out the economic and social inequalities that emerged because of that. He used the phrase, Karl Marx, the proletariat to describe the working class, and he used the word the bourgeoisie to describe the middle class. And he believed that the wealth of the bourgeoisie was created at the expense of the poor proletariat, because it was the bourgeoisie that controlled industry, it was them that controlled wages, and that the poor proletariat had no way of organising, and all they had to give was their labours, all they had to give was the shirt off the back. So Karl Marx is someone who a lot of socialist thought is rooted in, but he would be considered to be a revolutionary socialist, similar to Russian revolutionaries like Vladimir Lenin or Leon Trotsky. They were very much inspired by Karl Marx. However, the man on the right stands in the tradition of more moderate socialists, the more modern day socialists, and in fact, some of them accused of not even being socialists. Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010 in the UK, often spoke about himself being a socialist, but he was a far cry from the sort of socialism espoused by Karl Marx. And we will look at different theorists as we go throughout this, folks. So, we've got revolutionary socialism and we've got democratic socialism, sometimes known as social democracy. Okay, so I'll just move myself up here. Right, so the first aspect, again, we're sticking with that outline that we had before, and the first aspect is human nature. We said that conservatives had a very pessimistic view of human nature. However, socialists have a much more optimistic view. They believe that human nature is not fixed and it is on a sliding and moving scale all the time. We can reform ourselves, we can make ourselves better, we can be better versions of ourselves. That's because we are social creatures who learn from our experiences and from our context. But that would also explain why people do bad things because their behaviours are rooted in their experience. If you've got two people, for example, one is a criminal and one is very law abiding, one is very successful, it's well worth considering what the experiences of those individuals have been. Are they a product of their environment? Socialists strongly believe that people are a product of their environment, and when people carry out evils or wrongdoings, then that is because of their environment in large part. And it's the same if people are successful, that's because of their environment. So our character, our personality, our nature can evolve. And socialists strongly believe that if people are committing crimes, if people are doing things that are wrong, that's because the political or economic or social system in which they live have created problems for them, and they find it easier or they find it more accessible to make these mistakes. So therefore, they have an optimistic view of human nature. Even if you've committed crimes, even if you've had a particularly negative past, then you can make progress, you can improve as you go along. Okay? So, they also believe that humans are geared towards cooperation rather than competition and will rationally seek to work together. Now, this is a key point of clash between socialism and conservatism. This notion that uh, conservatives believe that people thrive and get better because of competition, whereas socialists believe that actually cooperating is a better way of getting things done and it is better for the community. Rather than isolating ourselves in little platoons, it's easier for us to get along and work better and more cohesively if we believe in a sense of community rather than competing against one another. Okay, so sticking with this idea of human nature, have a look at this quote, folks, from John Donne. He says, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." Now, what that means is that you cannot separate the individual from their circumstances. You cannot separate them from the environment in which they live. So, therefore, we can explain human nature uh, because of the societal impact. Now, Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative, once apparently, and sometimes is misquoted as saying, um, there is no such thing as society. What her intention was in saying that is up for debate, but a socialist would strongly disagree with such a view that there is no such thing as society. They believe that actually we are social creatures who have emerged because of our society. So, if you have a look at this, folks, just to give you a wee bit of information about the Labour Party itself. Now, the Labour Party is often said to be a socialist party or a party with socialists in it. Some deny that it's a socialist party at all, but historically it has been seen as a socialist party. And within its constitution, um, back before Tony Blair became leader, it committed itself to this idea of the state or the public owning industries. And it changed that in Clause 4, but it still spoke about the idea of collectivism, the idea of a shared solidarity, and that's an important word, a shared solidarity between people. If you have a look at Clause 4 of the Labour Party Constitution, it believes by the strength of our common endeavour we achieve more than we achieve alone, so as to create for each of us the means to realise our true potential. And it speaks about a community where power, wealth, and opportunity are in the hands of the many, not the few. And Jeremy Corbyn spoke about the many, not the few in his last two elections as Labour leader. So even though many socialists within the Labour Party felt that the new Clause 4 was less socialist than it really should have been. Many would argue that actually it embodied uh, socialist ideals on human nature. This idea of an idea of collectivism, of shared solidarity, of the importance of community, about the ability of individuals to grow and to thrive given the right circumstances, given the right environment that they are working within. So, skipped on a wee bit there, folks. So, our key questions for this, okay, we want to define collectivism, first of all, and two reasons why it's deemed important by socialists. Try to interpret what that quote by John Donne actually means within the context of socialism. Now, for question 4, it's asked you to use the Modern Studies textbook. I'll try and upload a photo for this, folks. If I'm not able to, if you just do a wee bit of research on strain theory on the internet, that should be absolutely fine. And please do the extension. How does it compare or contrast to the human nature argument of conservatives? Okay, so make sure you do that. That extension kind of feeds into what we'll do with essay writing at a later point, folks. Okay. Okay, and this moves us on to society, aspect 2. So, I spoke a wee minute ago about Margaret Thatcher's view on society. There'd been no such thing. But crucially, socialists see society as being divided along class lines. Now, this is the idea of people being organised into different categories based on their income, wealth, status. So, the socialists generally believe, and they have, again, I want to really stress that they've got different scales on what they think about this, that income and wealth really define society. So, for example, if you are someone who works on a very low paid job, you have similar interests and similar desires and needs to those who are in similar paying jobs that someone who's earning hundreds of thousands of pounds or whatever have a completely different reality. So this is actually what, remember, Benjamin Disraeli was worried about, the conservative thinker. But socialists believe that class defines society. That when we look at society, it is very hard to get a harmonious blend within society, whilst there are such deep economic and social divisions. So this idea that the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, the middle class and the working class cannot possibly view society through the same prism because they come at it from such a different angle, that is the key dividing line within society. Now, conservatives actually argue that inequality in many ways is good. We shouldn't have everyone as leaders. We shouldn't have everyone as managers or people who are earning the same amount because people have got different skills. But socialists generally believe that inequality is something that should be mitigated, or if you're a revolutionary socialist, something that should be evened out entirely. So again, Marxist socialists and moderate socialists tend to disagree on the extent of the importance of class within society. So if I can get you to check out this video, folks. Now, this was Ian Duncan Smith, who used to be the Conservative Party leader, but was also Secretary of State for Department of Works and Pensions. And he introduced a lot of the changes to the welfare benefit system within the country. And he visited Easter House in this picture and spoke about how it was important to try and help the plight of some of these people in this area. Now, socialists would strongly argue that the plight of people in this area is largely to do with the inequality that is being imposed upon society, and that people living in the poorest areas of, say, Easter House cannot possibly relate to the experience of even someone just up the road in somewhere like Lenzie, which is actually quite affluent and middle class. So, don't know why this keeps moving back, folks. Right, hopefully that's that. Right, so when we go back to the conservative view that organic society is something that emerges over time and that it binds society, Now, a conservative would look towards the monarchy, for example, and say lots of working class people support the institution of the monarchy. But socialists argue that really, the institutions are beyond, are actually not important in this regard, because ultimately it's not about the monarchy, it's not about tradition, it's about class. Society has evolved and changed because people who are wealthy have made more wealth and have increased their wealth, whereas the poor are exploited in regards to that. And people who are at the very bottom can't make that progress within society. So society is very divided upon class lines. And that's why socialists often argue for closing the wealth gap, because if you want people to see society in the same way, then you've got to change their economic perspective on that matter. Someone growing up in the poorest area of Easterhouse will not have the same experience as someone growing up in Dullator, in Cumbernauld, which is actually quite a wealthy pocket of Cumbernauld. Even within Cumbernauld, you've got some very poor areas, some very wealthy areas. People from those two areas will not have the same view in society, and it's very difficult to keep a cohesive society in that regard, according to socialists. So, if we have a quick look, so this PowerPoint's misbehaving a wee bit, guys. So, if we look at this, this is a socialist looks to define society in a sociological fashion. If we look at poverty, lack of education, they say there's a cycle that it's actually very difficult to get out of, and that's why the state needs to intervene and mitigate these problems and close that gap in wealth. People got low income, that means they're hungry, poor, that means that they can't access education the same way. If they can't access education the same way, they'll have a lack of job opportunities that pay well. And then if they have children, sometimes it's hard to get them into the habit of undertaking educational opportunities, etc., etc., etc. So, just some statistics here, folks. I'm not really going to go into them, but these sorts of statistics would be used by socialists to try and argue that society is very unequal because of these statistics, and thereby making the case that society needs to be made a bit more equal. That's one of the crucial points, folks, is that socialism, the main driving force behind socialism, is the idea of equality. Okay, your questions here. So, again, which type of socialist argues for a classless society, folks? Remember that distinction between Marxist socialists, like Karl Marx, like Lenin, etc., and other socialists like Gordon Brown, for example, Ed Miliband. How is social class defined? Give a detailed answer. Now, I will attach in a booklet, folks, into the classwork tab. I want you to be aware that it doesn't really follow a pattern, so just be aware of it. Use it to glean information from, but don't rely on it being in any particular order. And in your own words, explain the different ways socialists view society between Marxists and Social Democrats. Okay, this brings us on to property, guys. We did say with conservatism that property, that the access to private property was a liberating element of people's lives. It was something that incentivized people to do better. If you own property, it gives you more opportunity to express your individuality and freedom. But socialists generally take a more, negative view on property. That if you accumulate property, if you buy a house, if you buy another house and then rent it out and you look to make money for that, what that will inevitably do is it will create a landowning or property owning class at the expense of those who can't afford to do that or have not had the good fortune to even inherit wealth. So socialists would argue that if you accumulate property, it will inevitably increase inequality. Conservatives would obviously argue against that, but if you want to close that wealth gap, socialists believe that property is one of the kind of key aspects. Now, again, not all socialists will argue about taking away private property. There is a scale, a sliding scale between revolutionary and more moderate socialists. Um, what they tend to argue more for, generally, socialists, is common ownership. This is the idea that the public own certain bits of property. So, for example, council housing. You know, if someone occupies a council house, if they want to move away, then that council house stock is available to rent from the council at a favourable rate. Also, things like public industries. So, previously British Telecom, which is now a private company, was a public company. They believe that if you bring things like the railways into public ownership, then you can drive down the price, you can make it more accessible for those at the bottom. Conservatives would obviously argue that it creates inefficiencies. So if you have something that's privately owned, like British Telecom, and you've got something like Sky, who both provide broadband, Conservatives would argue that that creates a healthy competition and it will produce a better product. Two better products, actually, because they're competing to outdo one another. Whereas socialists believe that actually having common ownership of property means that people like shareholders and things and people who own companies or own property don't start to accumulate excess wealth. It also applies to inheritance. If someone inherits money from their parents upon their death, then they inherit that money without doing anything to earn it. Whereas someone who doesn't earn money, doesn't inherit money, they start off life in a much poorer set of circumstances because of no fault of their own. So, what socialists would argue there is that inheritance is something that basically solidifies inequality from a very, very early age, and it's something that needs to be tackled. Now, modern day socialists who are trying to get elected will not talk about getting rid of inheritance, but they may want to favour ideas like higher inheritance tax to try and punish the idea of accumulated wealth and to try and make sure that wealth is redistributed a bit more equally. So, again, it's based on the market, private property. Remember, we said Conservatives tend to support the idea of the free market. Socialists are a bit more sceptical about the free market. So if you look at real estate in places like London, this particular flat, two-bedroom flat, is £825,000. If you have a job in London and you want to live in the centre of London where there's lots of good job opportunities, then you're completely priced out the market. And socialists would argue that that's the problem, is that if you allow private property to be put into the hands of a small amount of people, it will make things unaffordable for many. Conservatives would obviously dispute that view. Go back to inheritance just for a second. This idea that people get money because their parents were rich is something that socialists believe is it totally runs against the grain of opportunity and people trying to work their way up. Conservatives often talk about how socialists want to remove merit. Socialists would then hit back here and say, well, if someone who's born into a rich family inherits their money, where is the merit? And I've used the phrase here, folks, that socialists believe that it often will cement inequality into the fabric of society. Okay, so you've got your questions here on property. There's a few ones to go through there, folks. I will also try and link in the alternative models of ownership by Labour Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. It's important to just stress here he is no longer the Shadow Chancellor after Labour's defeat in the 2019 election. That role now belongs to woman from Aberdeen, Annalise Dodds. But I will give you this extract to see what you think about this, folks. John McDonnell, incidentally, is someone who is an old-style socialist. He is quite far to the left of his colleagues in the Labour Party. Sorry, this PowerPoint keeps jumping ahead, guys. I have no idea why. So, aspect 4, the role of the state. Now, again, a lot of it comes down to the idea of class. Socialists believe so many things are based on class, inequality, and the problems which emerge from capitalism. Okay? Now, the traditionally socialists would see the state as an instrument of class rule. It's a way of saying the poor are the poor, the rich are the rich, and the state is there to uphold that status quo. So, what people like Marx and other socialists, and even moderate modern day socialists, would argue is that the state can be reformed to be an instrument of good. That if you look to change the way in which the state operates, it can even out some of those inequalities. So the state should start to play an active role. Remember how we said Thomas Hobbes believed that the state should be uh, quite, it should be a strong authority, it should be a strong state, but not an interfering one. The socialists believe that the state should actually be active in trying to iron out and trying to even out social and economic inequality and injustice as they would see it. Okay, now if we look at how socialists have done in government in terms of how they've operated their state, folks, um, if you look at a Marxist regime, now within a Marxist regime, in reality, Marxist regimes cannot function as democracies because the state needs to control things from the centre. It needs to control the price. It needs to control how the industry is run. It needs to control employment. So that's the only way in which you're able to deconstruct that kind of class divide is by controlling things centrally. And if you look at Russia during the after the October 1917 revolution, that's what they tried to do. It's what they've attempted in Cuba, in Venezuela, and these ultra-socialist Marxist regimes. North Korea would fall into that as well, folks, although um, that's a particularly odd example to use, and there's a good reason for that, just because of the way in which North Korea is run. You've also got social democratic or democratic socialist regimes. So, over the course of many years, you've had left of centre governments like the Labour government within Britain. You've also had the social democratic government that used to be in place in Germany, the socialist government under Francois Hollande in France, who was there before Emmanuel Macron, Cardoso, who used to be in Brazil. So this idea is that the state can be a force for good. It intervenes at key points in the economy and it looks to curb the worst excesses of capitalism. So the social democratic regimes see the state as a buffer against the worst excesses of capitalism. Marxist regimes look to overturn capitalism in its entirety. So, for example, we live in a society that would be it's indistinguishable from a social democratic regime because the government is active in helping smooth out inequalities. They get involved in gender legislation, race legislation, looking to close the wealth gap. Generally, it's a moderate way of doing things. But Marxism is this idea of overturning it. But socialists generally believe that the state, in its unrefined form, is or in its original form, is something that will maintain the status quo and it will uphold the privilege of the wealthy and the bourgeoisie, whereas they believe that it can be reformed to intervene to help people. So, you've got your questions here, guys, on the role of socialists. This idea of revolution. This is a key distinction. If you think about Marxist regimes, they often talk about revolution, overturning society, whereas democratic socialist regimes tend to talk about reforms and incremental change. Okay, and for question 4 here, try and maybe look at some of these different states. I mean, China, Cuba, Venezuela. Are they democratic socialist regimes? Are they Marxist regimes? Are they none of these? Okay, so think very carefully about it. Okay. Aspect 5, guys. And my initial apologies for not including aspect 5 for conservatism. and this is the economy, and you'll notice that equality, class, a criticism of capitalism all falls into the socialist mantra. But basically, socialists generally believe that collectivism is a good idea because they believe in cooperation. So this is the idea that we work collectively to be productive for society. And I have I am also going to ask you to complete a documentary where you fill in the blanks on Marxism to look at the economic viewpoint of Marxists. So, what is collective, or what are collectivist economics? Conservatives argue that competition is the best way to make a society economically viable. Um, if I look at the price of something, I mean, I often complain about the price of going to see football. If I go to see Celtic St Mirren, it's 30 quid. Okay, and I'm thinking, for 90 minutes on a Saturday, what ordinary working class people could realistically sustain that? Now, many manage, but why does it cost £30? Because that's what the market has put it at. It's what people are willing to pay for a game of that standard. If I go and see Real Madrid versus Barcelona, I will be paying significant amounts. I actually checked out the tickets on a Thomas Cook thing one time, folks, and it was looking to charge me for something like £400 the ticket alone, because that's the market. So a conservative would argue that the market's a good thing because you can't artificially design prices. Um, why is Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi worth so much? Why are they worth £200,000 or £300,000 per week? Well, it's because they're in such high demand and there's very few people with their skills. So therefore, that's why you pay that. And people say it's ridiculous that they're paid so much more than doctors and nurses and all the rest of it. And in the plain light of day, that's true. But you've got many people who have the skills of doctors, many people have the skills of nurses. There is only one person who has got the skills of Lionel Messi. There's only one person who's got the skills of Cristiano Ronaldo, and that's why their value, that's why the market has set that value. Now, socialists would argue that this is something that is very, very wrong. That competition and the market setting the price can only take you so far, and in actual fact can be quite harmful. They argue that resources can be used more effectively if they are used in a collective fashion. That's why they will argue for things like rent caps, so that basically landlords can't exploit their tenants. It's why they will argue for a minimum or a living wage to try and ensure that workers at the bottom end are not exploited. Um, and if you're collectively, working together, it means that people will be more productive, according to socialists. If you think about competition in the economy, it's a dog eat dog world. So a conservative will argue, well, if your business isn't strong enough, then it'll die. Socialists will argue that that would place a lot of people onto the scrap heap, and it's a lot of talent that's been wasted there. But if you organise your economy centrally, if you design your economy centrally, then you can utilise talent much, much better and utilise resources much better. So, again, going back to this point, there's a wee picture from Still Game, folks, where you might remember the episode. If not, I think the episode is called Hyper. Basically, in Craiglang, a superstore called Hyperdale's opens up, and it's where everyone ends up going. And the local news agents, and the local post office, and a lot of local areas are sacrificed because people are going more centrally. It's like when I'm in bigger, I love going into the kind of local shops. If you were to build a Tesco down the road, or something like that, then you might end up seeing local businesses beginning to struggle a wee bit. And socialists would argue that competition basically sets us up against each other, and it's brutal for those who miss out, and you end up with unemployment. And actually, that will increase the welfare bill. Socialists often argue that when Margaret Thatcher closed a lot of coal mines because they were unproductive, they were uneconomic, what that actually did is it increased the welfare bill, people on out of work benefits. So socialists would argue that collectivism means that you're meeting the needs of the community, whether that be at a very local level or at a national level. By collectively working, you're serving the needs of that community. And many socialists would argue that that's what's happening during the coronavirus pandemic, that, you know, you are utilising your resources to what you need. Um, Jeremy Corbyn had claimed that, although he was criticised quite thoroughly for that. So try and think about examples of competition versus collectivism, and try and think, folks, which one you think is a better way of running your economy. Remember, socialists, moderate socialists, will accept the market, accept free market economics, but with a wee bit of collectivism in there. Marxists would not accept competition at all. Um, Ultra conservatives wouldn't accept collectivism at all, but some moderate conservatives would accept elements of collectivism too. Okay? So we've got a couple of examples here just to check out, guys. So if you think about collectivism, idea of trade unions who campaign together to try and improve working hours and pay, and the co-op, it's worth checking out the history of the co-op, folks. And one particular theorist in that booklet that I said to check out, called Robert Owen, um, who ran the New Lanark Mill. So I'd maybe check that out, folks, about how collectivism was put into action in the past. Karl Marx, check out that documentary, folks. Karl Marx spoke about that capitalism didn't serve the public, didn't serve the people. It served a very, very small economic elite within society at the expense of others. I want to see if you agree with Karl Marx's viewpoints. In the modern world, generally politicians steer clear of Karl Marx, although many of his ideas have influenced the way in which we think, either for better or worse. Okay? Check that out at your own time, folks. I'd maybe make some notes on this about the difference between revolutionary socialism and social democracy. I'm not going to read that out to you. You can have a wee check of it yourself. This is some of the key differentials. And Ed Miliband, the former leader of the Labour Party, his father was Ralph Miliband, who was a Marxist intellectual. He was an ultra-revolutionary Marxist. But his son Ed was a much more moderate socialist. He spoke about responsible capitalism. So, unlike his father, he accepted the need for capitalism, but felt it was possible to smooth the rough edges of capitalism, that capitalism need not be a force for desperate inequality and things, but that it had to be curbed. It couldn't just be let to run loose. And you've got some questions on the economy there as well, folks. Have a look at this guy here as well. Do a wee bit of research on John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes is someone who was an important thinker, economic thinker for socialists. Definitely worth checking out as you go throughout this. Okay? So, just to finish off, guys, it's important to remember that socialism, in all of these 5 aspects, contradict conservatism to an extent. But socialism is a very, very broad church, and it's really important that you don't necessarily just put everything into the one boat. I mean, you should avoid that if you possibly can. So, answer the questions for each of the aspects in as much detail as you can, referencing theorists where you can. Check out the Karl Marx documentary and fill out the worksheet which accompanies it. And also use the booklet that I've given you to help you out there, folks, with some of the answers. Don't take that. Most of the booklets I will give you across the year, in fact, all the booklets barring this one, will follow a very, very clear structure. The PowerPoint is your structure for this, not the booklet itself. This booklet for Ideologies will just give you a wee bit of a reading material. And I'll also include the John McDonnell article for you to check out for that question. All the best, folks. One more thing I'll get to check out is the song The Red Flag. Now, The Red Flag is a socialist anthem. It's still played at the Labour Party conference every year. Many Labour Party members just look away when it's on because it's very communist, it's very revolutionary in its words. but it is a socialist anthem that commands a lot of support. So it's worth checking out. I'll put a link in for it for the red flag as well. All the best, folks. Take care. See you soon.